Hello, I'm Gwen Hill at Pine Ridge Baptist Church ladies class, and we're studying the book of Daniel. We're in chapter 4. We're going to be picking it up in verse 28 here in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about background for this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar is he has just had another dream that he can't understand. He's called all these wise people in. This time he told them the dream, but they still couldn't tell him or wouldn't tell him what the dream meant. It's kind of hard sometimes to tell a dictator who has nothing above him, that he is above all in his government and can do whatever he chooses. You really kind of don't want to be the one to tell him news he's not going to want to hear. But he's telling him the vision, and they told him they couldn't interpret it. And then Daniel is remembered, and he has sent for Daniel. And he's told Daniel what the dream was, that he was lying in the bed, and then an angel came and gave him a vision. And it was a great, great tree, but all of a sudden, this tree was hewn down. It was a beautiful tree. It provided shade for all the little animals and a home for them and shelter for them. And now it's down. Its fruit, it had been abundant in fruit, and now it wouldn't provide the food for these little animals and birds any longer. And he watched it hit the ground, and he knew it was very significant to his reign, and he wanted Daniel to tell him what it meant. Daniel walked in and did the common greeting of "O King, live forever," and then he was told the dream, and Daniel begins to interpret it with Nebuchadnezzar. And he got into the dream, interpreting the dream, and he said, "Oh, if only the dream applied to your enemies, or the meaning to your adversaries." He didn't want to tell Nebuchadnezzar just what this dream was. But one good thing that was positive in this chapter, I remember that Nebuchadnezzar's writing this chapter. He was given the great blessing of being able to write a chapter in God's book. And he said, he told Daniel, he said, "Daniel, don't be afraid. Tell me what you say. Tell me what you say." And so Daniel did. And it hurt him. He didn't want to say those bad things, what the dream actually meant. The dream actually meant that Nebuchadnezzar was going to be stricken. He was going to be made like an animal and live wild in the weather and outside and eat outside, even eat grass for food product for 7 years. And this is bad. I mean, he just it was just terrible, and it was upsetting to Daniel. And Daniel is pleading in chapter 4, verse 27 with the king, and he says, "Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and renounce your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." Daniel's trying to find a way to get Nebuchadnezzar back in God's good graces. And when we start in verse 28, you think maybe he did, because the reason I say that, a whole year went by. Our God's very patient. Have you noticed that? Our God is very patient. He's been exceptionally patient with me. And he is a very patient God and a very loving God. In verse 28, we continue the story. All of this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, and then 12 months later, the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and he said, "Is not this great Babylon I have built as the royal residence, and by my mighty power, and for the glory of my majesty?" Oh, Neb. In verse 31, even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people and will live like the wild animals. You will eat grass like the oxen. 7 times will pass by for you before you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone that he wishes. And immediately what had been said to Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and he ate grass like an ox. His body was drenched with dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. And at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High. I honored and I glorified him who lives forever. I'm going to stop right there and let's go back and let's unpack this just a little bit. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar was warned by Daniel that you need to change your attitude, son. What God says is going to happen will happen. The only thing that would change it would be if you made a life change that showed the Lord how sorry you were for what you've already exhibited. I don't know that that will change his mind, but that's the only thing that's got a chance. And a year later, we see that Nebuchadnezzar couldn't do it. Couldn't or wouldn't do it. So God has been patient, and I imagine every day Daniel spoke with Nebuchadnezzar. I imagine that several times it's happened that he said, "Oh, King, it didn't happen today, but it could happen tomorrow. Let's have a conversation." Nebuchadnezzar wasn't ready. So 12 months later, as he was walking about, observing everything that he took immediate control and prestige from and credit for, looking at how beautiful it looks, and he was just full of praise, but the praise was all for himself. He was taking so much delight in what he was seeing. He was taking so much delight in the accomplishments that he had caused to come about in Babylon. But the moment that he spoke, giving himself all the credit and Jehovah God none, Jehovah said, "Okay, it's time. I'm going to teach you a lesson, big boy." And a voice came and told him, "Nebuchadnezzar, you've not obeyed. You've not learned." So the punishment happened. All of a sudden, this regally dressed man is devoid of his mind. He lost his mind. He became as a wild animal, as a beast in the field. He ate grass. And as he spent 7 times equals 7 years, as he spent 7 years in the fields within Babylon, his fingernails grew to look like talons. His hair, he was ungroomed for 7 years. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Can you imagine how he stank? Oh, he would have been something that you would have not wanted to get near. He would have caused the little children to run in the other direction. There's no record of him being violent for those 7 years. However, before this even happened, he would go to great lengths sometimes to test the loyalty of his servants and of his army, and none of them trusted that he wasn't in his right mind, and that if he did something untoward, they just looked the other way because they was afraid he would come to his senses enough to do away with them. He lived like an oxen. He slept outside. The dew fell on him, and he did 7 years that way. 7 years penance. And at the end of that time, at the end of the imposed period of madness, God redeemed him and let him come back. And he said at the end of that time, this is verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Can you imagine what this king of all kings, the most powerful man on earth at that time, this man, what all he had, the grooming he would have enjoyed on his person, as he stood there looking out over all the lands of Babylon, and then he was made mad, and for 7 years, can you imagine what he looked like? Can you imagine to him what he looked like when he looked at himself? He raised his eyes toward heaven, his sanity was restored, and it says, then he praised the Most High. I honored and I glorified him who lives forever. This God that Daniel has been telling him about all this time is now real to him. It's very real to him. And he continues in verse 34, exalting God. And he says, his dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the power of heaven, and the peoples of the earth, no one can hold back his hand or say, what have you done? He said he's a law unto himself. He has all the power of heaven and earth. He is the creator. There is no power that is able to stop him. He is eternal, and he has dominion over all. What a difference from the man who 7 years earlier had walked around the parapet of the castle and had patted himself on the back for all that he had made happen. In verse 36, and at the same time, Nebuchadnezzar speaking, and at the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and my splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. I'm going to stop right there. If you go out into secular writings, there is the Babylonian kings wrote almost constantly. They had their scribes writing to detail and keep a record of every single solitary thing they did. This was a way they kept their legacy going. Scholars now, in researching Nebuchadnezzar, there is a 7-year gap that there's no information about him. Kind of bears out the Bible, doesn't it? Nebuchadnezzar continues, and he says, my advisors and my nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne, and I became even greater than before. Have you ever wondered why they didn't just lock Nebuchadnezzar up somewhere and seat another king? They didn't. I don't know why. It is supposed that they didn't because they didn't trust Nebuchadnezzar. He was prone to test the loyalty of his subjects. Very elaborate testing at times. And they couldn't be sure that he wasn't testing them now. It also could have been that God, Yahweh, put a hold on their suspicions, that they were also in kind of a sleep for 7 years, that they didn't pursue another king. They just lived from day to day like it was. But now they have awakened. Now they are also seeing Nebuchadnezzar coming forth, now back to being the king he was before, even better, because now he's worshiping the one true God, and things are coming together. Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his throne. Everything was better than it was before. And verse 37 says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, Praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. He said, even if you're the king of Babylon, don't get too big for your britches, because God is able to humble anyone. He exalts who he pleases, and he humbles those that require it, those that are walking in pride. It is amazing. The next chapter is chapter 5, and we're going to be talking about the writing on the wall. Okay. I know this is a little shorter than normal, but I want to get back to trying to get a chapter in, or at least half a chapter. So we're going to go to the next lesson. We'll go next week's lesson. See you then.